Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell. It's Thursday, April 3rd, 2014. April already. And I have a lot of stuff I want to talk about today and get to. So I want to start right off. No announcements or anything like that. Because for quite some time now, I've been following the development of what I call the BRICS Entente. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And I've been arguing that as an inevitable consequence of this loose alliance, that this group of nations, if it is to stay economically competitive, it has to challenge the US dollar as the reserve currency. And more importantly, it has to set up its own independent international financial clearing. And there have been a number of stories that have been reported in the last couple of weeks. And I'm going to use this as backdrop to an article that I believe that all of you should read. I'll link it to you. The article is entitled, "Is Putin Quietly Dumping Russia's US Treasuries?" And this is a very, very important article. It's rather lengthy. We'll be talking about it later on. But the context I want to set up for this are some articles that appeared recently, and I'll link the Zero Hedge article for you. And its title is, quote, "China and Germany sign Yuan settlement pact, and Obama heads to Saudi Arabia." And here are the quotations from the article. This is from Zero Hedge, citing Bloomberg, citing Business Week. So in other words, this story has appeared in a number of different outlets. Quote, "Germany's Bundesbank and the People's Bank of China agreed to cooperate in the clearing and settling of payments in renminbi, paving the way for Frankfurt to corner a share of the offshore market. The central banks signed a memorandum of understanding in Berlin today when Chinese President Xi Jinping met German Chancellor Angela Merkel," the Frankfurt-based Bundesbank said in an emailed statement. Germany's financial capital prevailed over Paris and Luxembourg in a euro area race to win trade in renminbi, which overtook the euro to become the second most used currency in global trade finance in October, according, listen carefully, to the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, unquote. Now that's SWIFT, folks. That's the International Clearing Agency in Brussels, Belgium. Now, you'll note what that article said is something very significant. Frankfurt won out over Paris and Luxembourg, and I suspect that the hidden story here is the looming economic and financial problems in France. And in other words, we've been watching this economic situation in Europe spread from Greece to Italy, Spain, Portugal. Now it's moving to France. And I suspect this is one reason that Paris and Luxembourg did not win out over Frankfurt. And this means something else very significant. I think what we're looking at here, folks, is the beginning of that establishment of international clearing in renminbi and an international clearing system independently of SWIFT. And you'll notice that Frankfurt is the home to the Bundesbank and it's also home to the European Central Bank. So I suspect that these are very strong moves. Hidden behind the scenes, of course, is Germany, but I suspect that these are also very clear moves that we're watching the beginning stages of putting in a system of international financial clearing based on something else other than the dollar. And that's a very significant development. Now, I've been also stating all along that part of reserve currency status depends on navies, and in the modern age, this means space. So we're going to see, I suspect, to come out of this story, we have to also watch any news or developments about joint or mutual space programs or activities between Europe, China, and Russia. I think this is the next thing that we have to watch for. But now let's turn to Russia. This is the part of the story I want to get to because there is going on right now huge financial fallout from the West's meddling in the Ukraine, from the Russian quote-unquote invasion of the Crimean, and now the U.S. imposition of what really amount to some rather toothless sanctions. I want to point out an article uh, that's entitled Putin Flushes U.S. Dollar, Russia's Gold Ruble Payments System Delinked from the Dollar. And the subtitle to this article is A New Financial System Independent from Wall Street and City of London Begins to Take Shape Concretely in Russia, and that's a question mark. Now, there's a couple of things to notice in this article. Quote, after sanctioning several Russian banks to punish Russia for the Crimea, the Washington politicians were told by the financial powers that be to step back because obviously the Wall Street vampires understood that putting Russian banks outside the reach of their blood-sucking teeth is never a good idea. And so what's been done is imposition of sanctions individually on certain banks in Russia and certain Russians themselves rather than the entire country. Now, Russia's response to this was rather interesting. There was a statement by Mr. Putin himself, and I want you to listen to this very carefully. This was made to the Russian Duma on March 28th, so within the last week. Putin himself has lobbied for a new system, in other words, of a Russia-wide clearing in rubles only, decoupled from the dollar. This is what he's talking about in his statement to the Duma. And he says, quote, why do we not do this? This definitely should be done. We need to protect our interests, and we will do it. These systems work and work very successfully in such countries as Japan and China. They originally started as exclusively national systems confined to their own market and territory and their own population, but have gradually become more and more popular. So in other words, as I indicated last week, Russia is now going to go to a domestic clearing system. But this is, I think, a stage in a wider development, including international independent clearing free of the dollar with these bilateral agreements between various countries and China to clear in renminbi. Now, I want to go to this article because I really want to bring this article to your attention. I will link this on YouTube and link it on the website. The article again is entitled, Is Putin Quietly Dumping Russia's US Treasuries? And this appeared at www.caseyresearch.com. All right. And I want to read a number of statements from this article because this is a really, really good article. It gives you the historical background to what's going on and why currently Russia is running rings around the United States geopolitically and financially. All right. Let's go all the way back to the invasion of South Ossetia by Georgia in 2008 during the Beijing Olympics and the Russian response. The article states the Georgia invasion was nothing compared to the bomb Russia was dropping on U.S. markets. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson was in Beijing for a family trip to see the games, but he worried about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac the whole time, as he was told the Russians had approached the Chinese to work together to dump their Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac shares. As for the Chinese, Aaron Back reported for the Wall Street Journal in 2011 that China's sell-off of Fannie and Freddie securities in 2008 was widely credited with pushing up mortgage rates in the U.S. at a time that Washington was struggling to revive housing sales. He cited U.S. Treasury data stating China has been steadily selling its holdings of agency securities since mid-2008. Now remember this date because if you recall way back in Financial Vipers, in Babylon's Banksters, I was arguing or proposing the idea that the derivatives bubble and then the subsequent implosion of the housing market may have been deliberate economic warfare. So this is a little suggestion that that's been what's going on. Now, I want you to pay very close attention to these next remarks in this article because they're very, very important concerning what has recently happened in the Ukraine and why America's response has been so, let's be honest, toothless. Listen carefully. This is from that same article. Quote, how many of the world's leaders would have the foresight to structure a loan as a private sector Eurobond? One sovereign debt expert called the structure of Russia's $3 billion loan to the Ukraine, quote, clever, unquote. Here's why. Instead of handing aid money directly to the Ukraine, Russia had the Ukrainian government float $3 billion worth in bonds denominated in euros. Note the denomination, not dollars, euros. So that's yet another strike against the dollar's reserve status. But now listen very carefully to what Russia did. Russia then bought the bonds, but that's not all. The Russians had a provision written into the bond that if the Ukraine's debt to gross domestic product level reached 60%, Russia could call the bonds for immediate payment. Such qualification in government bonds is very unusual. Today, the Ukraine has euro bonds outstanding to several countries, so stifling only Russia isn't an option because it would hurt the price of all of their debt. America's Beltway pundits agitating for a large aid package to the Ukraine should realize that Putin's foresight ensures that any U.S. aid money will find its way to Moscow. This is why Mr. Putin is being very magnanimous and he's not pressing any further in the Ukraine. Now let's go on. I want to bring some more things from this article to your attention because this is very, very important. It's safe to say that Putin is smarter than your average politician. For instance, Saudi Arabia's influential intelligence chief, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, met with Putin last year and offered to buy $15 billion worth of arms from Russia in return for Putin abandoning his support of Syria. Bandar even assured Putin that the Saudis would never sign an agreement allowing a Gulf state to ship gas through Syria. Putin just laughed. He knows a pipeline through Syria would mean Russia's Gazprom would lose its European gas business to Qatar. Zero Hedge pointed out last August what is shocking in all of this is that Saudi Arabia was so stupid and or naive to believe that Putin would voluntarily cede geopolitical control over the insolvent Eurozone where he has more influence, according to some, than even the European Central Banker Bernanke, especially in the winter. Saudi promises or not, Putin's no dummy. Europe obtains 30% of its natural gas from Russia, and half of that runs through the Ukrainian pipelines. Putin's energy stranglehold is strongest in Eastern Europe, where several individual countries are at Russia's mercy. Slovakia relies on Russia for 93% of its gas, Poland 83%, Hungary 81%, the Czech Republic 66%, and Austria 61%. All are captive customers of Russia. Now, let's go on to the idea of the sanctions that we impose. This is what the article states about those. Quote, in response, the most powerful country in the world sanctioned a few Russian individuals and a mid-sized bank Putin does business with. This toothless action gave Putin another laugh, and he responded by imposing some sanctions of his own on John Boehner, Harry Reid, and others, as well as 13 Canadians. While Obama and Angela Merkel make nasty noises in Russia's direction, the holy grail for Moscow is a natural gas supply deal with China that is currently now close after years of negotiations. And notice I predicted this and talked about this in last week on the News and Views and in the blogs. This is something that's coming, and all of this means, folks, quite frankly, that to call Russia a regional power is simply nonsense. Now, there's one final thing that I want to bring to your attention in this long series of quotations and then my final comments, and that is this. There has been a recent sell-off of U.S. sovereign debt securities and a recent buying of them, all right? And the story was that Belgium has now become a huge holder of U.S. securities. Now, I want you to listen very carefully to the analysis in this article once again, and I'm quoting it rather than trying to summarize it so that you will hear the actual words. Quote, the statistical release for the week ending March 12, 2014 sent Fed watchers into speculation overdrive. The release showed that custody holdings fell $104.5 billion from the prior week. This was the largest weekly record on largest weekly decline on record by a wide margin. Speculation is that Russia sold or dumped billions of dollars in Treasury holdings in response to the sanctions imposed by the Western governments over Russian actions in the Crimean. Although the wholesale dumping of U.S. debt is possible, it does not look likely on this scale. For one thing, the repatriation of billions of U.S. dollars would require the Central Bank of Russia to enter the foreign exchange markets and buy rubles. Not much point for Russia to sell its U.S. bonds, then keep the proceeds in U.S. dollars. Okay? So, what actually is going on? Well, if you turn a little bit later in this article, they give you a speculation that I think is probably true. They state, quote, further, a government can acquire Treasury securities from a private foreign entity where the transaction occurs on a foreign securities exchange and the security is held outside of the U.S. Here again, the foreign holding may not appear in U.S. data, or it could appear as a holding by the custodial government. Either way, it skews or corrupts U.S. data. In other words, what they're stating is that one country can hold U.S. securities for another country. And this is what they say is happening in Belgium. Quote, the first example is what might have happened with any presumed Russia selling. Russia could have moved its treasury holdings out of the U.S. and into foreign custody. This would account for the large drop in the March U.S. data. And there is evidence that suggests where the securities may have gone. Belgium is a small country. Its gross domestic product and foreign currency reserves are about 420 billion US dollars and 29 billion US dollars respectively. Yet its treasury holdings are reported at 310 billion US dollars as of January 2014, and the size of its holdings has nearly doubled since August of 2013. That positions it as the world's third largest holder of US debt, right behind China and Japan. This lopsided treasury holdings to GDP ratio strongly suggests that Belgium is in the custodial business. Now, let me stop right there, because what this means is that if this article is correct, Russia is using Belgium, the seat of the European Union in Brussels, and the seat of SWIFT, International Financial Clearing, very clever, you see, as the custodian holding their holdings of U.S. sovereign debt. All right. So this is another move, in my opinion, of the BRICS nations extending and trying now to make certain that Europe in the long term, is going to go with them rather than remain in the U.S. orbit. But now let's go back to the way that Putin structured those debt bonds in the Ukraine, with that proviso that when the debt to GDP ratio reached a certain percentage that he would call the bonds. Well, folks, here's the bad news. Our sovereign debt is now vastly beyond the 60% ratio that Putin negotiated with the Ukraine. In other words, I think we can expect some international pressure now to be put on the U.S. to curb its own deficit spending to bring that ratio back down. And they've got the financial guns to make sure that that will be done. Anyway, that's it for my news and views this week. See you on the flip side, everybody. God bless.